Good evening. Off and on over the past 18 months, thousands of churches have closed their doors or severely limited attendance as part of America's war on the coronavirus. Some have done so voluntarily, most under government orders. Did those issuing the orders have proper authority to do so? Was it wise or necessary for churches to obey? Widely known theologian and ethicist George Grant, pastor of Parish Presbyterian Church in Franklin, Tennessee, founder and director of Meadow Study Center, and a leader in the classical Christian school movement, is author of over 50 books, which is more than I typically read in a week or a month. And he joins us tonight to discuss these and related issues with particular attention to the Warrenton Declaration on Medical Mandates, Biblical Ethics, and Authority. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. I look forward very much to having George speaking with us. But first, I have a challenge for you. Remember posters like this? Whether from real life in your youth or from animated cartoons right up to today, you remember them. They called you to assist Uncle Sam, the United States of America, in the fight to preserve liberty and justice through the fateful years of World Wars I and II and the Cold War. Well, Americans and our allies in the free world won all three. Today, though, we're in what I call Cold War III. This time, the threats to liberty and justice don't come so much from foreign nations, though those remain. Instead, they're right inside the US of A. They're the elite leaders of the Green Movement and the woke progressive movement, which threaten to rob America of its productive capacity in the name of saving the planet, and of its liberty and its justice in the name of so-called social justice. They're the professors and teachers who fill students with environmentalist and socialist propaganda. They're the liberal mainstream media who trumpet bad news regardless of its falsehood, because after all, bad news is good news. Good news is no news. If it bleeds, it leads. And there are the politicians bent on spending trillions of your and your children's hard-earned dollars in a vain attempt to curb global warming that poses far less risk than the poverty their policies will impose on billions of your neighbors near and far, and to impose socialism on America. You know what's given them so much success thus far? Recruits, activists, boots on the ground soldiers of their anti-human, anti-Christian, anti-liberty, anti-justice ideology. To win Cold War II, to protect liberty and justice, to tear down the green barriers to prosperity in the developing world and the preservation of it in America, we need our own recruits, our own activists, our own boots on the ground soldiers, and I want you to be one of them. It's not hard. All you have to do is personally share the truth with your neighbors, with the educators at nearby Christian and public schools, and with your church leaders and your elected officials. And we'll make it easy for you. From now to the end of September, while our supplies last, we'll give you the ammunition. When you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of any size, we'll send you not one, but 10 copies of an educational resource listed at this page on our website. To request yours, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on blog, and then scroll down until you see Time to Play Your Part to Win Cold War II. There, pick your item, then click on the donate button, and when you come to the comments field, write in its title and promo code 21-09. That's promo code 21-09 for September of 2021, and the title of the resource that you've chosen. Now to our guest. Dr. George Grant has been a friend of mine for right about 30 years now. He's one of my heroes, not least because he writes books about as fast as I can read them. George, welcome to From the Stacks. Please tell our readers about yourself. background, your
Well, thank
passions,
you.
what you perceive to be God's calling on your life.
It's such a great joy to be with you again, Cal. God bless you. I am so appreciative of you. And if I'm one of your heroes, you're one of mine, most assuredly, and have been for many, many decades now. I'm a pastor, and that's my primary calling. I love to disciple men, women, boys, and girls in the truth of the good news of the gospel. But I also am, because I'm a pastor, I'm very much engaged in the issues of our day. So I've written, as you say, a number of books. I've got a radio show. I appear on The World and Everything in It, World Magazine's daily news program. And I have a website, georgegrant.net, where a lot of these resources are available. I believe, with Francis Schaeffer, that the gospel applies to everything, and therefore we need to make certain that we're thinking hard about the tough issues of our day. And if pastors don't lead the way, no one will. And so I've I've done my very best to jump in and wrestle with the big issues from as biblical a perspective as I possibly can. And in that regard, really, I've just sort of walked in your footsteps because you've been doing the same thing for about the same amount of time.
Well, and it's exciting because what it means is that we get to think through how the Bible applies to every different aspect of life, and when we think that way and we read the Bible, we have questions in our mind about our own lives, in our own times, in our own places, even when we're reading, say, 2 Samuel 7 or Joshua
Exactly.
3 or something like that. And we're always trying to think, okay, how do we learn from this so that at the very least, we don't make the same mistakes they did? I mean, the Apostle Paul tells us in
Right.
1 Corinthians that all of these things were written for our sakes about all the things that happened in the Old Testament so that we can learn from it, and in many cases, learn from it what not to do. But that's
Right.
pretty delightful, intellectually satisfying work to do, as well as it's really how you take care of the sheep, because the threats to the sheep, the wolves, come in all sorts of different shapes and colors. They come behind all sorts of different ideologies. And if we're not aware of how to meet each of those different threats, we can't really defend the sheep. Well,
Amen.
George, you have written and taught on so many different topics. I mean, among your 50 books, you have a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. You have a book on Planned Parenthood. You have Bringing in the Sheaves, a book on how churches can assist the poor through their diaconal programs, and many, many more. I've only listed, what was that, three, and you've written over 50. But tonight we're discussing the ideas in a declaration that you didn't write, but that you did have some opportunity to have some input on it before it was finalized. And
Yes.
you were the very first person whose signature is listed on its website.
Mhm.
This is the Warrenton Declaration on Medical Mandates, Biblical Ethics, and Authority. Fascinating document. I really enjoyed reading it. I would wish that every pastor, every elder, every deacon in America would read this, and certainly many church members. Uh, Now, first, give us a little history of the Warrenton Declaration and how you came to be involved, and sort of what was your input.
Well, I have been involved in writing a number of different, or participating in the writing of a number of different manifestos or declarations or statements in the last few years. I was part of the team that put together the Nashville Statement on human sexuality. I was the
Hmm.
primary author of the Franklin Statement, which we produced just before Obergefell came out to help to define marriage in a biblical fashion. And so when a number of theologians and pastors began to wrestle with the fact that many Christians and many pastors were not thinking hard about the issues that arose during the COVID pandemic, it was probably pretty natural that they would at some point contact me and ask me what I thought about the drafting of a new declaration. And so I got a chance to be involved. I was not one of the authors, but I did get a chance to have input. And particularly in the first section, I was able to give some shape to the declaration. And as a result, I was very pleased, though, again, I didn't write the whole thing, and that there are some aspects of the declaration that I might have wanted to reshape a little more, just like in the Nashville statement. I was very, very happy to be able to add my signature as one of the first signatories of the Warrenton Declaration.
Yeah. Yeah. You're never absolutely perfectly satisfied with any modern declaration, or even the Constitution of the United States, I think, would probably have had a few improvements. But it's only Scripture that is God's inerrant word, and therefore only that should we ever think is absolutely perfect. But I do think the
Right.
Warrenton Declaration is very, very good. With you, I would wish to put a few things a little differently from how they're put in there. Might want to add a little strength here, pull a punch there,
Right.
that sort of thing. But I think it's very, very good. Now, one of the things that you mentioned to me before we went live was that a part of your concern was that if this just came across as an anti-vax document, it would have no effective audience, partly because big media, big tech would just bury it so that it wouldn't get much attention at all anyway. But partly too because, well, the anti-vaxxers would be all on board and the pro-vaxxers would be all against, and there really wouldn't be much conversation. What this does, I think, instead is say, all right, look, you got to make your own decisions about vaccination. You have arguments for and against vaccination and so on. People will encounter these. But here are some underlying ethical issues that we think really need to be thought about. And they're entirely distinct from the medical science issues. They're issues of fundamental understanding of biblical social order, so to speak. So let's walk through the declaration a little bit. We won't have time to address every point, but we can hit the highlights. The first thing to notice is that it's divided into two sections. The first section on authority, and particularly the concept of jurisdiction, and the second section on medical mandates. And those medical mandates would not just be vaccines, they'd be masks, they'd be social distancing, various different things under that rubric. And the document starts by affirming that all authority in heaven and on earth belongs to Christ. And then it lists some to whom Christ delegates authority: civil, ecclesiastical, vocational, familial, and many people will be surprised at this, the individual self is an authority. Well, why is it important to recognize these various different authorities? And is there a hierarchy here so that maybe one of these authorities is at the absolute top and can rule all the others? Or is this a little bit different, where maybe there are points where authorities don't overlap at all?
Those of us who have been privileged to live under the Constitution in the United States are familiar with the concepts of checks and balances, of separation of powers. This is a concept called jurisdictionalism or federalism The idea
Mhm.
of jurisdictionalism is that we live in a fallen world, and therefore all of us are flawed. Therefore, none of us should have absolute authority. But it's not just individuals who are fallen. The institutions that individuals create reflect that fallenness as well. Therefore, none of the institutions that we create should have absolute authority. This is a principle that comes straight from the scriptures. The scriptures create jurisdictions, jurisdictions of authority that have a checking and a balancing effect on each of the other jurisdictions. So
Mhm.
God gives specific areas of authority to the family, specific areas of authority to the state, specific areas of authority to the church, and then we're given specific areas of authority for individuals. This is why self-control is such a big issue in biblical ethics. There are always going to be moments where these jurisdictions overlap a little bit, sometimes sinfully so, sometimes because one jurisdiction has to correct the other jurisdiction by checking and balancing it. But the beauty of the biblical system is the recognition that because of the fall, there are no perfect and therefore no absolute authorities that can exist, because if they do, they will naturally run to tyranny. So when the state usurps the family's authority, that becomes tyranny. When the church usurps the authority of the family, that becomes tyranny. When the family usurps the authority of the church, that becomes tyranny. What we've got to do is, when we study the scriptures, enumerate those areas of authority and make sure that each institution stays in its lane.
Mhm. And so in the Warrenton Declaration, you start off with this issue of jurisdictions, and then you begin to argue, or the authors of the Declaration begin to argue, that in fact, when it comes to policies for trying to protect people from, SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, some of these jurisdictions have overstepped their bounds, and some of them have failed to fulfill their own duties, have failed to exercise authority where they should. And some of that responsibility is even to challenge another jurisdiction when it does overstep authority. Would you just develop that for us a little bit? Where where have some of these jurisdictions, I think, failed to challenge the the trespassing by other jurisdictions in
Yeah.
the COVID pandemic?
Well, one of the things that we have to do anytime we're wrestling with this broken, fallen world that we live in is ask the question that the Apostle Paul asks in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, which is simply this: what do the scriptures say? What we see is that God gives jurisdictions real authority, but the natural inclination of the fall is to overstep the bounds of our authority, to infringe on the authority of others. The state has very, very specific and enumerated responsibilities, but those enumerated responsibilities don't include most of what happens in Washington, D.C. And so part of what we as citizens are responsible to do, and part of what the church is responsible to do, is to enter into that prophetic calling of declaring where the state is out of bounds. In the same way that we would have to say the same thing to a family that was out of bounds or a church that was out of bounds. That prophetic calling declaring what is true is the first step of justice. We see that over and over again in the Old Testament. We see it in the book of Proverbs. We see it in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul calls the Christians in places like Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi to declare the truth in the midst of a world filled with error. You can't read the book of Jude, for instance, or 2 Peter without realizing that there is this strong call for believers to ardently defend the boundaries of what is right and good and true at all times and in all ways. So part of the failure of our day, I believe, is that there's a lack of courage and there is acquiescence and compliance in areas where unthoughtfully the church or the family has simply yielded to the overreach of corporations, of the media, and of the nanny state.
Now, some people will tell us that because Romans 13 commands Christians to submit to the governing authorities, the powers, the exousia, as Paul uses there, therefore Christians simply must obey, and they have no choice but to do that. How would you respond to that? Particularly the claim that, well, this means if the mayor or the county council or the county health department or the governor orders that churches not meet, well, then churches shouldn't meet.
Well, the first thing that I would do is remind everyone that that was not something that the apostolic fathers would have subscribed to. Peter so boldly said, what would you have us do? Obey men rather than God? And then later he would simply say, we must obey God rather than men. The Westminster Confession of Faith, which is a wonderful summary of biblical doctrine, spends an entire chapter, chapter 20, dealing with that very issue and pointing out more than 36 times in the scriptures where it became necessary to defy authorities that were stepping beyond their appropriate bounds. You can't know the story of Elijah. You can't know the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can't know the story of Esther. You can't know the story of the Apostle Peter or the story of John or the story of the Apostle Paul without realizing that there are times where we have to obey God rather than man. You can't read the book of Daniel without realizing that there are times when a wise appeal before a magistrate is a necessary thing for the preservation of liberty of conscience and liberty of faith. So the scriptures are replete with examples of honoring the magistrates when they are in their proper bounds, but challenging the magistrates or challenging other jurisdictions when they step beyond those bounds.
Let's try to bring this into the present, to the current situation with the pandemic and government responses to it. What would you say are examples of government orders, civil government orders, federal, state, local, that Christians must obey? What would be some that Christians must disobey? And what would be some that Christians might disobey without violating Romans 13, but perhaps it really would be a matter of individual choice, where some might obey and others might disobey, and neither one be sinning by doing so?
That's a great question. I wish lots of Christians were asking that question and wrestling with what the scriptures actually say. So examples of laws that that are not necessarily biblical laws, but that the state has put into place that we should just obey, are things like traffic laws, uh, laws concerning weights and measures, laws against graft and corruption, laws respecting property rights. Those kinds of laws, while not necessarily in every case explicitly mandated in the scriptures, are legitimate exercises of governmental authority. They give order, safety, and security to a culture. Uh, a, a, there are passages that point out very clearly that if there are laws that cause us to violate God's law, to disobey God, those are laws that we must disobey. So, for instance, a pharmacist may be in a state where a regulation is handed down that they are required to fill prescriptions for an abortifacient drug. That's a law that pharmacist must disobey. There are hospitals that have state sanction requiring doctors to participate in abortions or in gender transformations in these horrific injections of hormones in young children. Those are the kinds of mandates that a Christian must disobey. Then the Warrenton Declaration makes a statement. It simply says that disobedience is permissible and should any command be given outside the jurisdiction of a particular authority. The key word here is permissible, not mandatory. So if a jurisdiction makes a mandate concerning a kind of social distancing that says families can't get together for Thanksgiving, it would be permissible to disobey that order and gather the family around the table and have Thanksgiving.
Now,
When
why do we think that the state has transgressed its boundaries, has overstepped its authority if it says families don't gather for Thanksgiving? Why do we think that?
Well, first of all, there is no constitutional and there is no legal mechanism by which law-abiding citizens can have their right to assemble taken away from them. There is, in the past, when there have been epidemics, there are quarantine laws that can be put into place that this can be argued, but it can be a legitimate application of the state to create quarantines. But quarantines are for the sick. It keeps the sick safely out of the way of the well. It doesn't lock down the well. And so historically, scientifically, and legally, the state has no ground to stand on for draconian lockdowns. In the state of Michigan, for instance, the governor issued a series of executive orders that allowed Walmarts to be open, but they had to section off certain parts of the store where they were not allowed to sell certain things. There were artificial distinctions created concerning what was and what was not an essential worker. All of these are arbitrary. None of them were actually legal in the sense that laws were passed. These are not things that were passed through the legislature, tested in the courts. These were simply draconian mandates imposed through a series of semi-legal executive orders. The most recent declaration by President Biden about companies over 100 employees having to vaccinate, that's not even an executive order. It's an executive mandate. which has no enforcement mechanism. It has no constitutional foundation. It has no legal bearing. The only way that that can be enforced, and the way it is being enforced right now, is through voluntary compliance. When a company says, oh, well, the president said I have to do this, so I have to do this. The problem is that we're not clearly telling people, no, 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 no. It's not a law. It's a desire of the president. It may or may not be founded in good science, but let's ask the question, and let's not immediately, complacently acquiesce to these infringements on our liberties, on our neighbors, and on our businesses.
Okay. In a moment, we're going to continue along these lines. I want us to delve a little bit more, maybe more specifically, into some of the kinds of instructions, orders, mandates that are being given by various different levels of government here in America related to the pandemic. But before that, I'd like to remind all of our viewers of our offer of wonderful educational resources this month. We are asking you to become part of the team of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the Christian faith with its worldview, its theology, its ethics, and most importantly, its gospel. The good news that we, sinners like me, can be reconciled to the holy God by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, in the work that he did on the cross and in his resurrection from the dead. What we're asking for you to do is to become a disseminator of good information. And here's a way that you can do it. From now through the end of September, as our way of saying thank you for a tax-deductible donation of literally any size, we'll gladly send you 10 copies of an educational resource listed at the page that you're seeing now on Cornwall Alliance's blog. To get there, the easy way is just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on blog, and then begin scrolling down, and you will find this very quickly. After you've gone there, choose the resource that you would like to have 10 copies of to give away to friends, to teachers in schools near you, to your pastor, and so on. Choose that item and then click on the donate button. And when you come to the comments field, write in its title, the title of the resource that you chose, and promo 1-. When you do that, we'll be delighted to send you 10 copies of that resource, and you can become part of the Cornwall Alliance's outreach efforts. Now let's return to our special guest, George Grant, and our discussion of the Warrenton Declaration on, well, let's see, now I've suddenly forgotten the full title, the Warrenton Declaration on the pandemic.
Medical mandates, biblical ethics, and
you.
authority.
Thank you. Our wonderful producer got it up in front of me there. The Warrenton Declaration on Medical Mandates, Biblical Ethics, and Authority. George, Section 2 of the Warrenton Declaration applies the principles of jurisdiction that were developed in Section 1, where we talked about the multiple different authorities, the boundaries that they have, the fact that there's some overlap, but there can also be transgression. And each of these different authorities needs to stand up for itself and to resist the overreach of other authorities. All of them need to play their own parts properly. Now, Section 2 follows that, and it starts off with denying that civil authorities have been granted, by God that is, lawful jurisdiction and authority over personal, familial, or public health. Yet American governments, from the federal, the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, and more, to states, to counties, to cities with their health departments. They all claim authority related to public health. Why does the Warrenton Declaration just flat out reject civil government having authority over public health?
Primarily because the scriptures make it plain that families and individuals have responsibility in this area. Now, there are some ways that a government can assist in the arena of healthcare. For instance, it is always good when the federal government comes alongside and assists the private sector in facilitating quick research and development of needful medicines and needful treatments. So that would be a good thing for the federal government to say, we have a crisis, let's help hospitals accelerate this process. That might be debatable from a tax perspective or a budgetary perspective, but it wouldn't necessarily be a violation of the state's jurisdictions because they're facilitating the private sector. But there is no constitutional, no legal, no judicial precedent, and there is no biblical warrant for the state to be making medical decisions for individuals. It's astonishing to me that the Biden administration can, when it comes to the abortion issue, trumpet my body, my choice, while reversing that when it comes to the COVID vaccine issue. So one of the things that the Warrenton Declaration attempts to do is to say, look, this is not about vaccines per se. This is not even about what is appropriate or inappropriate medical treatment for things like COVID or future epidemics that may come along. The real issue here is who has authority, who can exercise coercive control on whom, and for what reasons. The Declaration simply says that the government can recommend, the government can educate, but the government cannot coerce. It simply does not have the authority. Beyond that, there is the concern that when the government does exercise coercive control, they create, in a sense, a tiered or stratified structure of citizenship. So we build into the economy and we build into society discriminatory laws, a kind of new Jim Crow legislation where those who do not abide by the preferred orthodoxy are pushed to the margins. Their voices cannot be heard. They're shut down on social media. Big tech will not even allow a discussion of the various issues. These are things that ought to deeply concern us because now we're talking about freedom of speech, the exercise of the liberty of conscience, the integrity of families, the rights of parents to determine what medical treatments their children should or should not have. I mean, we run into a panoply of new dilemmas when we allow the state to overstep its bounds like this.
Yeah, although the federal Constitution doesn't actually state that there is any right to privacy, contrary to the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade, which based the right to abortion entirely on a right to privacy. Many of the state constitutions do affirm a right to privacy, and our courts have again and again ruled that what gets done with one's own body, and that of course is distinct from what gets done to somebody else's body, which is the case with abortion. So this doesn't protect abortion, but what gets done with one's own body is up to oneself. That is a
Right.
matter of privacy rights under almost all the state constitutions. So,
Well, and
so let's think that.
it's also implied in the Ninth Amendment, one of the most neglected portions of the
Yes.
Constitution, that the Ninth Amendment looks toward Blackstone's commentaries, and it essentially says, look, in the Constitution, we can't enumerate all of the rights that reside with the people and with the states.
Mhm.
So even those rights that are not enumerated here, they belong to the individuals and to the states. Blackstone's has a whole chapter on the necessity of the recognition of private property and personal rights, the right to privacy, in a sense.
Yeah.
And so the Ninth Amendment really does reflect upon that. And then the 10th Amendment makes the argument that when those English common law rights are violated, there is a mechanism to protect individuals and communities from an overreaching federal government, and that is local magistrates who interpose themselves and say, I'm sorry, Washington, this far and no further.
Yeah. Yeah. I am so glad that you brought up the Ninth Amendment because, George, there is a book by one of your church members, my good friend David
Yes,
Fowler, who is the president of Family Action Council of Tennessee. This book is called Recovering the Constitution Using the Ninth Amendment to Restore Civil Liberty. This is a wonderful book, and I think it's just great that it happens to come up when you're on the show with me, and I get to recommend it. I would certainly recommend this to anyone who wants to see a recovery of the original constitutional order of the United States. But now, as far as the Warrenton Declaration is concerned, then, could somebody who approves of the COVID vaccines and says, yeah, I want to get them, and in fact, I recommend them to everybody. I think everybody ought to get them. Could someone who thinks that still sign the Warrenton Declaration?
absolutely. And they have. A number of the signers are people who have, for personal reasons, gotten the vaccine, but they believe that the issue here is not the medicine and it's not the pandemic, it's not COVID. The issue here is let's preserve the right of individuals and families to exercise appropriate jurisdiction within bounds uh, and keep the federal government, keep state governments, keep local governments in their lanes, not allowing them to have this kind of comprehensive overreach. And so,
Okay.
you know, these names that you're looking at here, there are a large number of them who have gotten the double jab, if you will, and who believe that the vaccine is a good and safe thing. There are many, of course, who are not in favor of the vaccine. They believe that it's experimental, that it's untested, and perhaps even unnecessary. But this is not about the vaccine. What this is about is the question of governmental competency and this cultural shift that has occurred where big corporations are enforcing something as law that is not law.
Well put. Very well put. Now, the Declaration goes on to deny that lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccine mandates can be justified by appeals to public health. And then it adds this that I think is quite insightful and worthy of discussion. It says, it is the Christian duty of each family to seek the well being of their neighbor, and that doing this includes, quote, reasonable practices for the symptomatically ill to refrain from knowingly exposing their neighbors and to live at peace with all men in a manner that displays the love of Christ in obedience to the law of God. Okay, so how might Christians act out this love of neighbor in the midst of a pandemic, particularly when there is so much animosity in the deeply divided community about this?
Yeah, one of the things that has escaped no one's notice is the level of division, the level of polarization, and the level of anger that has emerged. And what I have told our people, and what I try to say every time I'm able to speak on this, is that this is the perfect opportunity for Christians to demonstrate resolve and love. It is possible for us to be principled and simultaneously merciful. And so, what we need to do is make sure that we're taking appropriate steps at a time when many of us know folks who have become gravely ill or have succumbed to COVID, that we take reassuring steps in our churches, in our communities, with our families to make sure that we don't become a part of super spreader events. And so we need to, if we're ill, we need to stay home from church. If our children are ill, we need to not put them in the nursery. If we're suffering just from allergies, we might want to wear a mask, not because we feel like it's going to spread anything, but because it reassures people. I don't put a lot of faith in the efficacy of masks, and I don't believe in mask mandates, but I do believe that we need to be very, very tenderhearted to our neighbors at a time when there is so much fractiousness. In our own church, one of the things that we have done is we have attempted to tend to the sick, care for them, make sure that they have plenty of meals. We encourage the sick to stay at home. We take appropriate precautions. We do deep cleaning of our meeting spaces. We make sure that there's plenty of hand sanitizer available. We attempt to do our best to educate. We use fresh air for meetings whenever possible. For instance, on October 3rd, we're going to have a big hymn sing. We're going to do it outdoors. We have added a third service to our two normal services because they were very, very crowded and there's no possibility for social distancing. So this way, those who are concerned can spread out a little bit. These are gentle reminders to all of us that we do live in a time where tensions are high and people are concerned. But we also want to make sure that we're encouraging people to live healthy lives, that they are concerned about their neighbors, that they exercise that concern with real action rather than with anger and with a retreat from the culture.
Yeah. George, I do want to make sure that all of our listeners, all of our viewers, know that you are the pastor of Parish Presbyterian Church in Franklin, Tennessee, and I think what you've just described in terms of how your church is handling this matter of how to respond to the pandemic itself, and then also to various different government policies related to the pandemic. I think it's a good model of how churches should be doing that. And so I would encourage particularly pastors, elders in churches around the country to be in touch with Parish Presbyterian Church in Franklin to pose questions about how to form their own policies. I think this would be excellent. And of course, people who live near you and are not already churched in good, solid Bible believing churches, I would love for them to visit Parish Presbyterian. Now, George, looking back over the last 18 months, and we're going to have to finish up here pretty quickly. You told me that you will have to leave right at the top of the hour. But looking back over the last 18 months, What do you see as the biggest failures and the biggest successes in terms of churches' responses to COVID and to the civil government's actions with regard to it?
Well, I think that probably the greatest failure has been a failure of pastoral care, a lack of communication, a lack of listening, and a lack of genuine care for the flock has been one of the hallmarks of this season of fear, retreat, and mandates. What people need is not to be told what to do. They need to be encouraged. Their hearts need to be lifted up, and they need to be driven back to the Word of God. And so I would say that the biggest failure of the church has been in the church's primary calling. This should have been a season of solemn assemblies, of long seasons and concerts of prayer. It should have been a season of redoubling our efforts at pastoral care, of communication. This should have been a time where pastors dealt from the pulpits with past pandemics from church history. One of the things that I did the last two Easters in 2020 and 2021 is draw from the rich, rich heritage of American Reformed evangelicals who faced terrible pandemics of typhoid fever or a host of other pandemics, and they did so faithfully, preaching the Word of God with clarity. That's been our greatest failure, in my view. I think, in addition to that, our unthinking acquiescence to either the party line of the loudest voice in our community or the party line of governmental authorities in our community or in our nation has been a terrible failure. The church should always be a place where we examine things in light of the Word of God. We need to take to heart Abraham Kuyper's great dictum that there is not one square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not say, mine. When we recognize that, we apply worldview principles to every issue that comes down the pike, and we're able to give honest answers to honest questions in our day. I don't believe that during the COVID crisis, for the most part, the church has done that. There is a good thing that I think has come out of all of this, and that is churches that have been faithful, that have walked through all of the issues with care, thoughtfulness, and pastoral care, those churches are exploding with growth. As people start looking for places where pastors have backbones, where the gospel is preached, where hope is proclaimed, where jurisdictions are enforced, people are flocking there and yearning for more. We are seeing revivals break out in those faithful churches in pockets all around the country. And for me, that's great cause for joy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that's really concerned me, George, is I think a loss of the understanding of what it means for us to take up the cross daily and follow Jesus. Jesus died on a cross, and that certainly was the impression that anyone around him in his day would have gotten from the notion of taking up the cross. It would have been going off to die. And one of the things that was remarkable about the early Christians was how they were willing to take care of others in need, even at risk of their own lives. Uh, the early Christians, unlike most of the Romans throughout the empire, didn't evacuate a city when a plague came. Instead, they stayed and they took care of the sick at risk to their own lives because they believed in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting, and therefore they weren't afraid to die. They thought with Paul, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And one of the things that's really saddened me through the pandemic is the extent to which pastors and elders have not called on their church members to take up that kind of an attitude that says, I am willing to take great risks in order to help others in whatever way, whether it's bringing the gospel to them or helping them through a medical problem, or simply having that fellowship with them, that communion with them that is so crucial to our spiritual health. Well, George,
Amen.
thank you again for joining us tonight. Do you have a quick closing comment for us?
I think what I'd love to do is just read this short portion out of the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is from that chapter that I mentioned early in the broadcast. God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word, or beside it in matters of faith or worship, so that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commandments out of conscience is to betray true liberty of conscience, and the requiring an implicit faith and an absolute and blind obedience is to destroy the liberty of conscience and reason also. In my time through COVID, I have been given an opportunity to have an incredible ministry in a hospital network in Houston, Texas, where I go in, despite the fact that they have a chaplaincy corps, they fly me in, and I go in to meet with their maintenance men. These are plumbers, carpenters, engineers. These are the guys that keep the elevators running, the guys who make sure that the electricity stays on. And during COVID, when doctors and nurses and first responders were getting balloons and songs and videos, these guys got nothing but complaints. And they were working 18-hour days, and oftentimes not seeing their families for days and days on end. I've been able to go in and just give hope to them, proclaim these truths that God is Lord, He is sovereign over all things, and therefore we can have genuine liberty. And what I have seen is that in the worst days that these men face, they are seeing light and hope and life. That is what we need to be about.
Amen. George Grant, thank you again for joining us tonight on From the Stacks. It's been our pleasure and our honor, and love to have you back on to discuss another topic sometime. So we'll look forward
Let's
to
do
that.
it.
All right.
God bless you.
God bless you, George. Hey, folks, just one quick last reminder that through the end of September, as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of literally any size, we'll gladly send 10 copies of an educational resource of your choice listed on the page that is being shown to you now in the Cornwall Alliance's website, cornwallalliance.org. Just go to the blog and then scroll down and you will find this page quickly, or if you can write down the URL from in front of you on the screen, you can do it that way. Go to that page, pick your item, then click on the donate button, and when you come to the comments field, write in the title of the resource that you've chosen and promo code 21-09, and we will be delighted to send you a copy. Well, thanks again for watching. Join us again next week for another edition of From the Stacks, discussing current issues related to environmental stewardship, economic development for the very poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ.